Good morning and welcome. I am Mackenzie Babb, External Affairs Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School, and I'm so glad you could join us today for a press briefing launching our 2021 Trends in Entrepreneurship Report. The report is accessible via the link in the chat, and I'm happy to say the report is produced in partnership with the UNC Entrepreneurship Center and authored by a fantastic group of cross-sector, cross-disciplinary experts, 5 of whom you'll be hearing from this morning. We're going to get started here shortly, but before we do so, just a few housekeeping items. I want to remind you that you are welcome to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or if you prefer, for those joining by phone, you are welcome to submit questions to me directly via email. My email address is mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We'll be pausing briefly between each speaker to field a question or two with a full group Q&A toward the end of our 45 minutes together. We'll have a hard stop at 10:45 Eastern as our speakers will need to transition over to the green room for our 2021 Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference sound check. That conference is also open press, so if you would like to join any portion of that 2-day event, you may register at no cost using the link that's also provided in the chat. With that, it is my pleasure to hand things over to my colleague, Kenan Institute Executive Director, Greg Brown, to get us started. Greg?
Thanks, Mackenzie. Obviously, we're super excited about this year's conference and the trends report. It's really full of information I think is very important for understanding the current state of small business and entrepreneurship in the US and really globally. I want to start by recognizing Vicky Gibbs, who's the Executive Director of the Entrepreneurship Center here at UNC. This report is very much her brainchild, and want to recognize her instrumental role that she's played in its development. You'll be hearing more from her in just a few minutes about some of the content in the report. I really just want to provide a high-level overview of where small business finds itself today. Of course, 2020 was a wild year for the economy as a whole. It was an even more wild year for small business. Many saw revenues plummet to near zero. So think restaurants and hair salons and other non-essential service providers, especially those located in business districts that emptied out last year. Some of these have recovered, but many are still struggling or have gone out of business permanently. But other companies saw record growth in 2020. These include many tech companies, logistics companies, but also some more kind of traditional Main Street companies like manufacturers and construction companies. So these disparities continue into 2021 and are really evident in both the revenue and employment statistics that we're seeing. So I want to cover just some of the most interesting current issues. As government support for small business fades in 2021, there's going to be many companies that have become capital constrained. We know that financial constraints are generally more severe for small businesses, and in the near term, they're going to be even more severe than usual for small businesses. However, if we look at funding, for example, in the venture capital sector, it's never been stronger. VC deal activity continues to be near a record pace. The level of overall funding is expected to hit another record high in 2021. Some people are talking perhaps as much as $200 billion in venture funding this year. If you're fortunate enough to have a business that can raise VC money, then valuations are really high and funding is very plentiful. Another issue that we're keeping our eye on is potential labor shortage in 2021 for many small businesses. I mean, it may seem strange to be talking about that, just given how severe the employment shock was last year, but unemployment's already come down to 6%. We think that sort of frictional unemployment in the economy is much higher than usual because there's been such a disruption to operations and a mix shift in the type of companies that are operating right now. And there's been a lot of people that have left the workforce as well, and it's unclear whether they're going to come back or when they're going to come back. This has led in some places to a skill mismatch where unskilled and low-skilled workers appear to be in short supply. There are certain skilled workers that are also in very high demand. If you look at job postings, they've really spiked in recent weeks. And today's report that we got today on unemployment was actually the best since the pandemic started. And so what does this mean for small businesses? It means that they could have a hard time competing, because people are less likely to go work for startup companies, and because there's a labor shortage emerging in certain sectors, this could be another headwind for small businesses. Another thing I want to touch on is small business formation. So we've seen record small business formation, but we have a less clear lens on is small business failure. We've also experienced likely the worst year in small business failures in the history of the U.S. Or potentially back to the Great Depression, depending on how you measure it. And the fact that we have this new business formation isn't particularly reassuring when we look at the composition of many of these businesses. Many of them were done out of necessity as sole proprietorships for people that lost their jobs. There's also second jobs, supplemental jobs, hobby jobs. A lot of them are sort of online retailing type jobs, people selling things online, again, out of necessity. And also many of the jobs are unlikely to be businesses that grow and generate additional jobs. So what we're really seeing is a lot of disruption, a lot of churn in small business, and it's unclear exactly what the prospects are going to be going forward. So in a nutshell, we're seeing, I think, continued large divergences and opportunities based on type of business and industry, the type of owner, size of business, to some degree geography. And these are really the things that we have explored in the trends report and will explore in the conference going forward. So with that, I'm happy to either answer a question or turn it over to next speaker.
Great, thank you, Greg. And we did get a question that just came in. With so many first-time small business owners, what will the challenges and opportunities for helping these new business owners be to succeed?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that you have people who are inexperienced, they're on a steep learning curve and facing a lot of headwinds. So providing services that would help these companies survive, I think is going to be an important part of what folks like the Entrepreneurship Center here at UNC and other centers that people involved with the conference are doing, as well as government agencies and entities and think tank support groups. So I think there's going to be a lot of wood to chop to make sure that emerging new small businesses are able to succeed in the coming years.
Fantastic. And second follow-up question is, on page 12 of the Trends in Entrepreneurship report, you talk about the employment impact on early stage ventures with the deterioration in quality of human capital for those companies. What do you think the ongoing or long-term impact of that will be?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening in the venture space is interesting, I think, because it's a fairly small slice of the economy when you look at it. So you look at total employment by new venture-backed companies, it's a fairly small percentage of total employment. So the question is, what is the long-term impact? It's probably a great long-term impact. I mean, we need those highly innovative, high-growth companies, but in the near term, the employment impact tends to be much more limited from these because it takes a while for them to get going and grow into mid-size and larger companies. So I think one of the challenges right now that the broader economy has is, who's going to go work for what type of company and what sort of labor constraints does this put into the market? So especially newer, smaller companies are going to have a hard time competing for highly skilled people that they might need. So if you're starting a software company, it's a much riskier proposition to go work for a small new startup company than it is a large established software company. And this is just a constraint that, it's always a constraint, but right now I think it's a particularly acute constraint for startup businesses.
No doubt. Well, thank you, Greg. At this point, I want to turn things over to our next speaker. I'm just going to remind folks that we are going to take additional questions at the end of today's briefing. So stay tuned. If you didn't get your question answered, we will be fielding those later in the briefing. At this point, I want to turn things over to Professor David T. Robinson. Professor Robinson is Professor of Finance and the J. Rex Fuqua Distinguished Professor of International Management at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, as well as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. David.
Thank you, Mackenzie. It's great to be here with you, with Greg, and with everyone else on the panel. I'm really excited about the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship conference that we're about to kick off here in just a few minutes. I'm going to be chairing a session beginning at 11 o'clock that's going to start to talk about capital market disparities. Basically, in a sense, the difference between what we're seeing on Main Street and what we're seeing on Sand Hill Road, to go back to the question that Greg was just discussing. I think to kind of foreshadow what we're going to talk about, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and think about what did the economy look like with respect to racial disparity before the pandemic broke. And to kind of set the table, what we saw is we had an economy where, when you're talking about entrepreneurship, new business formation by Black founders and white founders, there were strong disparities. Black-owned businesses were starting smaller than white-owned businesses, and that's controlling for industry, that's controlling for the geographic location, that's controlling for a whole host of other factors. So it's not just people choosing different types of ideas that require different types of capital. Putting all of that to the side, the black business is starting at a smaller scale than the white business, and really the challenge for racial equality in this context is that over time you do not see convergence. You don't see the racial gap diminish as the businesses sort of gain business traction. Black-owned businesses start smaller and continue to persist at smaller sizes. Part of the reason for this, and this is something that we found in a report that's been recently published in Management Science, is that Black-owned founders anticipate discrimination from banks, and therefore they are more likely to say that they did not apply for a loan even though they needed one. And the reason they didn't apply is they feared that they would be rejected. So, setting the stage, before the pandemic broke, we were living in a world where there were pronounced capital market disparities between Black-owned entrepreneurs and white-owned entrepreneurs. And that was really coming from not only the way people were being treated in the capital market, but the way they were expecting to be treated in the capital market. Now the pandemic breaks, and what do we see? Well, we saw actually what looked almost like a little bit of good news, where you saw Black unemployment rise by less than you would have expected given the nature of the shock. Where we saw the biggest damage in unemployment was in the Latinx community. However, what happened is that racial disparities in unemployment grew over time, because there was a rebound in employment in May and June, early in the summer, that was much more pronounced in white employment and much less pronounced in Black and Latinx employment. And so that meant that going into the summer, we were seeing more pronounced racial disparities in employment. We had the payroll protection plan and the economic injury disaster loans program. We saw those roll out. Those rolled out in a manner, if you just counted up loans, they rolled out in a manner that was pretty fair in terms of hitting minority neighborhoods at about the same rate as white neighborhoods. But that's looking at loan counts, not loan sizes. The disproportionate amount of money flowed into white communities, not into Black communities. And also the money flowed later into Black communities. So I think the pandemic and our response to the pandemic, in a sense, exacerbated trends that were already present, largely for the same reasons that the initial trends were present, that there are differences in the way communities of color are treated by banks, but also how they expect to be treated by banks. And that perpetuates a lot of the problems that many people are focusing on trying to solve. So I offer that really as just foreshadowing for our first session, which is going to begin, as I said, just in a few minutes, 11 o'clock, the top of the hour. Mackenzie, I should probably turn it back to you here.
Thanks, David, for that. We got a great question that came in. You touched on the exacerbation of inequities that we've seen during the pandemic. The question that came in is, when it comes to how the pandemic disproportionately affected women and minority business owners, what was a result of pre-existing inequalities and biases, or was there something pandemic specific that impacted those businesses differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think both elements both elements raised there are important. I think that the bulk of the reaction is a reflection of pre-existing trends. In other words, minority small business owners were much more likely to have a more tenuous relationship with their bank, to have fewer banking relationships, and to have less, a shorter duration of banking relationships with the banks that they had. And so when you turn it around and look at rolling out PPP from the bank's perspective, it's, if it costs about the same to process the loans for everyone, you're going to naturally skew towards larger loans with more established customers whose information is easier to fold into the loan process. And so that disproportionately, that put Black and women founders, Latinx founders at a disadvantage relative to more established businesses. Then I think there's the question of, were they operating in sectors that were harder hit, or were they more disadvantaged? And I think that's certainly part of the story, but I think that's a much smaller part of the story than just the presence of the pre-existing conditions.
That's helpful, David. And we got a couple of other questions I'm going to save for that open Q&A that we'll be doing at the end of the session. But at this point, I want to hand things over to our next speaker, Professor Yael Hochberg. Yael is the head of Rice University's Entrepreneurship Initiative and the Ralph S. O'Connor Professor in Entrepreneurship and Finance at Rice Business. Yael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. My piece in the Trends Report is really focused on something a little bit different than what you've heard about from Professor Robinson and Professor Brown. A lot of the work that I've been doing recently is really focused on thinking about policy interventions and how we can be supporting innovation-driven entrepreneurship here in the US, and how we should be thinking about education towards innovation-driven entrepreneurship. And in particular, one of the issues that I've been thinking about recently, and that I think we need more thought about in this country, is the fact that many of our interventions and programs that have been meant to support entrepreneurs and startups really focus on support for these startups and companies once they actually already exist. And that includes programs that are meant to provide technical assistance and capital grants, or to provide tax credits or other incentives for investors to invest in new startups. And many of these programs are created with the goal of creating entrepreneurial clusters and innovation economy employment in regions that do not have these in abundance, and really addressing some of these disparities that we have around who engages in entrepreneurship in this country and who does not. And unfortunately, not as much focus has been really spent on understanding what we need to do to support and encourage the creation of these startups to begin with, and to understand why it is that we do not see as much of this sort of activity in minority communities and in certain regions of the country, particularly as it pertains to innovation-driven startups and to the commercialization of scientific and engineering breakthroughs and fundamental research that's happening every day at our top research universities and national labs. And that is really key to our continued competitiveness as a country moving into the future. We often operate in a manner that really assumes that new innovation-driven startups will simply appear from the ether, and that the missing piece is support once they emerge. But when we talk about innovation-driven entrepreneurship, particularly in deep and hard tech and in areas that require investment in infrastructure and specialized equipment, it actually requires much more support earlier in the process to really bring new discoveries to proof of concept that will actually allow for the formation of startups and the determination of market potential. My latest research that's covered in the Trends Report provides some strong evidence that private capital markets will actually come and support new innovative startups if we can just do more to help with the translation and transfer of new innovation into the market. And one of the things that we need to be talking about more is whether our support dollars could be beneficially spent on thinking about how we help encourage the translation of new scientific discoveries out of universities and to real applications in the market. And there's two big looming gaps here to address, one of which is entrepreneurship education, and the other is funding for translational research that bridges the gap between scientific discovery and market opportunity. Entrepreneurship education at many of our institutions of higher learning in this country is ad hoc or non-existent. There are entire communities of underrepresented minorities at HBCUs and MSIs and in other areas of our country that really are just never exposed to the concept of entrepreneurship, have no idea how to approach or even consider launching their own ventures if they do have their own ideas. And a lot of the education we do have at the places we do have it has been targeted at business school students, particularly at the graduate level. And often it consists of recounting experiences and examples rather than teaching skills and frameworks as we do with other disciplines. We need more focus on codifying entrepreneurship education in the way that top business schools have done and focusing on commercialization of innovation in particular. And also thinking about education, not just for our business school students, but also for graduate students, postdocs, faculty, and research staff in the STEM fields. And then finally, provision of translational research funding is going to be critical for maximizing the potential of our federal research dollars and thinking about how American technological competitiveness can stay where it has been in the past for the future. There is a big gap between the risk level of basic research discoveries and what the private market is really able to support. And translational research requires funding and a new class of researcher. But all of this can be done, and there are examples of this out there. It can be done in a way that really incentivizes US R1 universities to partner and collaborate with HBCUs and minority serving institutions in their ecosystems in a way that really can support the creation of a new generation of innovation-driven entrepreneurs whose makeup, I'd say, more closely resembles that of the American population at large.
Great, thank you, Yael. The first question tees up exactly what you just touched on, which is there's a lack of diversity that's kind of particular to some of the fields that you just discussed, such as high tech. What can be done to support and educate underrepresented entrepreneurs in these fields?
Yeah, that's I think a key piece for us to be thinking about here. Part of this, I think, is exposure. We have been thinking about this very, very closely and very clearly at Rice, and trying to think about ways that we can actually think about our ecosystem as a whole and not just as a university. And examples of that are, thinking about how we take this translational research process and really bring in HBCUs in our environment. So we have funding, for example, from the DoD for translational research that we've sort of levered up in partnership with local HBCUs, where we're helping them apply for similar funding, and we're putting the equipment and the researchers on their campuses so that the talent that's there on those campuses, real talent, can actually be exposed to the kind of research and the kind of researcher and the kind of equipment you might see at an R1 university. And what we hope that will do is encourage more of those undergraduate students at the HBCUs to pursue graduate STEM education and to actually think about the concept of sort of engaging in innovation-driven entrepreneurship moving forward. And we think it's going to create a new class of leadership, and hopefully that I think that's a model that can be replicated at many other places as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yael, and excited to have you field a few more questions during our Q&A when we wrap with the full group. At this point, I'd like to tee up our next speaker, my friend and colleague, Vicky Gibbs. Vicky serves as the Executive Director of our Entrepreneurship Center at UNC Kenan Flagler Business School. And as Greg mentioned, is the architect and brainchild of the Trends in Entrepreneurship report. So Vicky, very excited to hand things over to you.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie. And I'm very excited just to see the trends report and all of this research come together. So my name is Vicky Gibbs. I'm the Executive Director for the Entrepreneurship Center at UNC Kenan Flagler. And we partner with Greg and the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise on the Frontiers Conference and on the Trends Report. And one of the reasons that we brought that together is because, we wanted there to be this source of truth that academia, industry, and policymakers could come to. And I have to say, after hearing just the speakers and my colleagues speak today, I'm super excited to see things come to life. Some of the things that Yael was talking about related to, early education and early exposure relates directly to what Rodney Sampson, the next speaker, is going to be speaking about, and his model of equity districts and exposure and socialization. That sort of, when you talk about entrepreneurial ecosystems and really looking at that broadly, how do we think about that in truly creating inclusive ecosystems? You have to start much earlier than traditionally we've done. So going a step back, so I come from the industry side. So I got a double E degree in the early 90s and graduated with my MBA in the late 90s. So right in the middle of the dot-com bust. And as a woman in high tech, in startups, I lived, that sort of being a minority in this field. And it's real, but I would have to say that the involvement of academics like the ones we have today, researching these subjects and really highlighting them, has really shined a spotlight on this challenge of diversity and inclusivity within entrepreneurship. And now we are starting to see much more activity, really trying to create and actively move the needle with addressing some of these issues that were highlighted by David and others. So one of the things that we are talking about today at the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference in a section of the Trends Report has to do with this subject of creating inclusive ecosystems. A piece of that is capital formation, which David and Greg are going to be focused on in their session, and that is really important. But in order for an entrepreneur to be successful, it is not a solo sport. It is not just about capital. It is about access to all of the other resources available. And the fact is that there is disparities in access across the board to those resources, not just capital. And when we talk about really breaking down systems that have been in place for a really long time, they took time to develop, and they're going to take time to break down. In our session today in the conference and in the report, we take a little bit different tact, and we tee up the problem. The problem is recognized and the problem is covered in other areas in the report, but we also start to look at solutions. What you see today is we're seeing massive experimentation going on, and we've seen this for the past 5 or so years, with definitely an uptick in some of this experimentation within the past year with the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Movement. And so what we are seeing is many different people, policymakers, academics, and also industry people who are actively creating solutions and models that are being tested in the market today. So in our session and in the report, we start to break these things down. There's things related to community development. The SEC has introduced new regulations to basically widen things like crowdfunding, which especially during the pandemic was a large way that many entrepreneurs, especially minority entrepreneurs, were able to access capital. The SEC just opened that up. And at the beginning of April, was it March, right at the beginning of this year, they basically went from the amount that you could raise via crowdfunding, went from 1 million to 5 million. So there are even other investment structures. So Backstage Capital, a VC firm that was started by Arlen Hamilton, they actually closed on a $5 million round as a direct result of that change in policy by the SEC. And now they're able to take those funds and deploy them to Black and Brown founders in the space who are doing amazing creative things. So in our session, we'll cover some of that policy. We're going to look at communities. So Rodney Sampson, who you'll hear from in a second, is going to talk about what he's doing around equity districts. We're also going to look at entities like businesses and investors and things that are happening in that space. Investment entities that Arlen has developed with Backstage and that Rodney has developed with 100 Black Angels and Allies, with a dual purpose, not just to create more money and capital access for Black and Brown founders, but also how do you create more wealth within Black communities for investors. So that is key for those. Then we'll also look at corporations and what they're doing. We've seen this model around venture studios that has really exploded over the past 5+ years. Venture studios is more than just an incubator or co-working space, but it's around how do corporations plug in and actually give startups access to not just mentorship, but also access to partners, access to customers. And we'll have Davion Ross, who's going to be on our panel, who is running a coalition venture studio for RGA. And so looking at how all of these models need to work together. And our hope is that by promoting some of these different models, some of these solutions, that the audience is going to be inspired and is going to learn things and be able to take those back into their own communities. So you're going to hear a lot more about it later today, but Mackenzie, I'll turn it back over to you.
That's great, Vicki. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one quick question. You mentioned experimentation happening on a high level. Will the new working environment, work from home, flex hours, et cetera, present any new opportunities for entrepreneurs to provide solutions to companies charged with pivoting to this new landscape, the way the BLM movement is bringing new opportunities for minority entrepreneurs?
So absolutely. I think, when we started the pandemic, people were often talking about like, how do we go back to normal? And now I think that we've been in it for over a year. People are really starting to think through the new normal. And so I think what we're seeing as it relates to ecosystem as we're relating to work from home, this is impacting real estate. It's impacting where people are working. I think it's also from an ecosystem perspective, providing a lot more opportunities as far as access to talent and access to capital, which were really rooted in geographies. We're now seeing that explode. I was actually speaking on a panel with an investor I was interviewing last summer, and they were about to hire their first CEO without ever meeting them in person, which was really scary starting out. But then it became, we just had to get over those things, right? Yes, things will go back to being in person. Yes, there is a need and there is a value in that. But we are seeing a lot of evolution around not only like work from home and those elements, also a whole bunch of evolution in healthcare innovation. So I do think there is a lot more coming out. There's a lot more issues being highlighted. So for example, one of the things that will be highlighted in the healthcare innovation or in that section of the report is around how a lot of minority communities are not included in clinical trials. And there's actually, a local startup, Clinispan, that is addressing that exact issue to try and get a more diverse group of people involved in clinical trials for COVID. So we're already starting to see that, and I think we will start to see that even more.
Great. Thank you so much, Vicki. We're going to have time to field additional questions here shortly at the end of our press briefing. But at this point, I want to hand things over to our final speaker, Rodney Sampson. Rodney is the Executive Chairman and CEO of Opportunity Hub, or OHUB. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Rodney, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Mackenzie. It's exciting to be here. I'm really excited about participating today. My contribution to the Trends report was really focused on the importance of building inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystems in, for, and by communities of color. This work was originally codified in research that was output as a guide in collaboration with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City a couple years ago. And then last year, we signaled a set of recommendations to cities in collaboration with the Brookings Institution on how to spur local economic recovery by increasing racial equity in local tech ecosystems. Just contextually and from lived experience, in 2000, I was the first Black founder to raise millions in venture capital in the South, or actually the Southeast, actually. That company was acquired in 2010 for 8 figures. And by the way, we were never able to secure bank debt financing. The bank called the day that they saw the news. So after we were successful with the exit is when the bank wanted to lend to us. Since that time, there have only been 300 Black and brown founders to raise over $1 million in venture capital. Think about that, 300 in 21 years. Juxtapose that to 11,000 mostly non-Black firms who raised venture capital in 2019. And the 2020 numbers appear to be even more dismal despite the increased flow of capital last year. And even the nascent traction that was experienced last year due to the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and many more. So why is this important? Well, venture may only represent 3% of the total investment capital stack in America, but it is literally the rocket fuel that is propelling thousands of companies that are now responsible for 60% of net new jobs. And that's creating DAIS, as we call it, diversity, equity, inclusion solutions, is critical to increasing the representation of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people of color in the workforce. Trends we're seeing, which we signal in the report, it's good to see colleges, universities, think tanks like Brookings, tech companies, startups, VCs, and even ecosystem building organizations since last year have started to acknowledge the link between economic justice and social justice, or economic dignity and social dignity. We saw some large corporations making large LP investments into Black and Brown venture capital funds that are investing at the pre-seed, seed, and Series A staging. So this model is promising. The pandemic also accelerated a redistribution of capital, companies, and talent from coastal ecosystems such as Silicon Valley, New York, and Seattle to cities like Austin, Miami, and Atlanta. This is powering the development of new commercial, residential, and multi-use real estate developments that are now being branded as innovation districts. Many of these innovation districts have expressed an interest in building diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions and equity districts into their developments. And equity districts deploy inside of the innovation districts early exposure programming, rapid upskilling via coding boot camps or software sales boot camps, intentional hiring partnerships, entrepreneurship support programs, accelerators, and venture capital, specifically for the communities that the innovation districts are located in. So this is promising, but yet also necessary to ensure that we don't increase economic segregation, economic immobility, and gentrification that isn't inclusive of the communities that currently live in these neighborhoods. So operationalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions across boards, talent, small business procurement, product development, go-to-market, investment, and impact throughout the technology startup and venture ecosystem. As we speed into the fourth industrial revolution at scale is critical to creating true racial equity and parity in society. So while most of the acknowledgements and commitments to date have been admirable, they still aren't enough if we want to close the skills gap, the jobs gap, and the racial wealth gap in our country. We must build density. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rodney. That's fantastic. We got a great question tying back to the trends report. This person says, the trends report says that FinTech played a key role during the pandemic, particularly in providing assistance to underrepresented communities. Why do you think that was? And do you think that the trend will continue? If so, what impact will that have on traditional banks?
You know, that's a great question. I think, you know, the data, kind of borrowed this from Janelle Monáe, but the data don't lie. And so when you look at the distribution of technology, especially mobile technology in socially disadvantaged communities, you know, in these socially disadvantaged communities, there are more mobile phones than their desktop computers or laptops. So when people think about the technologies, the neobanks that have come online, like First Boulevard and others, they are also targeting these communities. And, you know, we talk about this in our dais, and we'll talk about it in the dais certificate at UNC Chapel Hill this fall, but you have to be intentional about marketing to those communities. And that's so in the past, banks have just kind of done, you know, general marketing and not really thought about how to specifically talk to customers. And these new neobanks are doing that.
That's a great answer, Rodney. Thank you so much. At this point, we're going to open things up for a question or two with our full group. I know we are running a bit tight on time, but want to open things back up to our full panel of experts for a couple of questions that have come in. So let me pull those up real quickly. All right. Okay. Sorry, we've had a lot of questions come in and I'm trying to sort through them. This is a great one to start with. In the report, expert Sandra Moore talks about the cost of replacing an employee, things like lost productivity, recruitment cost, and onboarding. With so many small businesses faced with the needing to hire new employees to replace those lost during the pandemic, what do you think the economic impact will be? I'll open that up for the group.
I think the answer to that question really hinges critically on how many people re-enter the labor market. We saw people have spent a lot of time talking about the change in the unemployment rate, but the unemployment rate does not factor in the people who have exited the labor force. And as economic conditions improve, I think we're going to see people re-enter the labor force. And the extent to which their proportion and the composition of people entering new jobs is going to tell us a lot about the costs of, you know, bringing people up to speed in terms of skills and productivity.
I'll just throw in a quick comment. I mean, really one of the basic ideas behind PPP was to keep employees connected to businesses, just because of those frictions of you know, people being terminated and having to hire back and retrain people. I think that was successful in some businesses that were able to rebound last summer, but you look at other industries where things, you know, were shut down for a very long period of time, there's been more permanent separation of employees. And, you know, it's a double whammy. So not only were those businesses harder hit, but they're also going to have steeper startup costs when you know, they start to return operations to what they looked like pre-pandemic. So, I mean, I think it is a serious issue. You know, the extent of it, I don't think we'll know until we get further into the recovery and more of these non-essential businesses are trying to go back to full scale.
I think one of the unintended side effects of PPP, and I think this is something we're going to touch on later over the next 2 days, is that it encouraged stagnation. And so we can talk a lot about the cost of bringing people, reskilling employees that are going back into the labor force, but there are going to be lots of people who have held on to a job that is not a long-term, not their long-term job, and they're going to be jumping from one job to another, and those are costs those are adjustment costs that we're also going to face, and I think those adjustment costs were probably exacerbated by PPP.
The other thing I wanted to add is I think there's just reiterate, there's just a lot of unknowns right now. Like you saw an unprecedented number of women leave the workforce just because of work from home, school from home, and all of that sort of thing. You saw disparities in different communities, especially communities of color, get impacted just by COVID. And then we've also seen a rise in necessity entrepreneurs. So those that lost their job and opened their own business. And so I think all of these things, people are going to have personal decisions to make about what they do during this next season. And I think flexibility in the workforce, you know, not just where you work, but potentially how you work, full-time, part-time, structured. I think there's going to be pressures in all of those. And then how do you actually create this new work environment and culture when you also may have remote employees that you didn't have before? And so I think there's a lot of learning to be had, and with learning there is cost, but I think the companies that are able to iterate on that more quickly and experiment and be more flexible will be the ones who end up, I think, winning and getting the talent that is going to be available.
That's great. Thank you so much. I know that we are right at time, and I hate that we didn't get a chance to respond to all of the terrific questions submitted, but I just want to thank all of our experts again for sharing their insights and their time. And I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today as well. A reminder that we are scooting over to our 2021 Kenan Institute Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference at this point. That conference does begin at 11 a.m. Eastern. Registration this year is free. It's the first time we've gone digital, so you can find the link to register in the chat below. We hope that you'll be able to join us there, and of course invite you to learn more. Check out the report in full at frontiers.unc.edu. If you would like to continue the conversation with any of our experts individually, you can reach out to me. My email address is mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu, and I'd be happy to make those connections. We hope to see you at 11. Thank you for joining.